Okay, so on to our next borough. We are recording. So next we have Brooklyn. So that's going to be our next, very popular to visit. So in Brooklyn, I recommended visiting Smorgasburg. So Smorgasburg is created, it's a portmanteau. So it's a word that's two words really smushed together. And it's a portmanteau of smorgasbord, which I'm not sure if it's very well known in France, but it's a Scandinavian word for sort of a buffet, and Williamsburg, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And we see the smorgasburg here in Williamsburg, although now there are multiple. And as they write, it's the largest weekly open air food market in America, gathering dozens of vendors on the waterfront in Brooklyn. So we use this term a lot in English. We talk about being on the waterfront. We talk about eating at a restaurant that's on the water. So here we can see in the photo, we're on the waterfront. We're along the edge of the river. And there's also a very famous movie with Marlon Brando called On the Waterfront. So it's an expression that's used a lot. I think in the UK or France, we talk about like being on the sea or by the sea, and we don't use that in America. So we talk about being on the water, having a house on the water, or at the beach more often. So the New York Times dubbed Smorgasburg the Woodstock of eating. So as you can see, there's kind of a festival atmosphere here. There's many different vendors. It's not quite like Woodstock. Maybe there's a little bit of music, but it's more about trying different foods and buying different products. So on to our next borough. So now we're in Queens. So as I said, the biggest borough. So there's definitely a lot to do and visit. There's a lot of interesting food and different things to see. And actually there's even a farm museum, which is interesting to think about being in Queens and being on a farm. But I decided to choose the Museum of the Moving Image. So this museum houses the nation's largest and most comprehensive, which means complete, very thorough, collection of artifacts relating to the art, history, and technology of the moving image. The 130,000 artifacts rotate in different exhibits, including one honoring Muppets creator and puppeteer Jim Henson. The museum also hosts movie screenings. So we can see here the architecture of this museum is really cool and modern. And of course, it's a more modern museum because we're talking about TV, we're talking about movies. They do go back to kind of the first movie projectors and the first technology about movies and kind of old TVs from the 50s. But they also have more modern things, and they do film screening series. Here we have a very, very popular character in the US, at least, Kermit the Frog. So that was from the Jim Henson exhibit. And they had a big exhibit with all the characters from Sesame Street, which is also very iconic in the US, I think known a little bit in France, like Oscar the Grouch and Bert and Ernie, and all these characters that became a really important part of people's childhoods in the US and early education in the US as well. So on to our next borough. Let's head over to Staten Island. So Staten Island, of course, we have to take the ferry to get there. So we'll be down in that Battery Park area at the tip of Manhattan. And that's also where you can get on the Staten Island ferry, and you'll take the ferry over to Staten Island. So catch a Staten Island Ferry Hawks baseball game. This minor league team is named after the iconic Staten Island Ferry. Minor league baseball is less competitive than the major league, but tickets for great seats are affordable, around $15, and the stadium has a great view of the Manhattan skyline. So we can definitely see there the very iconic Manhattan skyline. Skyline's a really big word when we're looking at movies, looking at TV, looking at photos. A lot of art or even t-shirts that people create in New York will have the Manhattan skyline. And often if there's a big change in architecture, or even, for example, when there were the 9/11 terrorist attacks, we talk about changes to the skyline. So people remember the NYC skyline in a certain way. And then when it changes, that's quite a big deal for people because they have this image and it's different. But we can see a really beautiful view from this stadium. So a minor league team means that they're not playing against the Yankees, the Mets, the Red Sox. They're actually kind of before that. So some of these players will move up and they will actually join the major leagues after, but not all of them will do that. But it's kind of a more relaxed competition. And we have our fun feminist fact. So in 2022, Ferry Hawk Kelsey Whitmore became the first woman to start in an Atlantic League baseball game. So we do see also the difference between the major league. We don't, and I believe I would have heard, but we don't have women participating in Major League Baseball, playing for the Yankees or the Mets. But we do have some women in the minor league, and I think she's not the only one. So some of the smaller minor leagues also have women playing. So that's why I think this could be a really fun outing, because you can sit very close to the field. It's more interactive. And then also, for example, if you have families, children, or for you it's interesting, you can see a woman playing baseball, which is really cool. Okay. All right, so on to the next borough. So now we're going actually all the way up. So we wouldn't do this all in the same day, but we would be returning on the Staten Island ferry to the tip of Manhattan around Battery Park, and then taking one of the trains all the way up to the Bronx. So for example, we can take the 4 or the 5 train, actually go from the bottom tip of Manhattan. And those are the express trains, which is important to know if you're visiting New York. When you get on a subway, you can have running on the same line. You can have a local train that makes a lot of small stops, or you can have an express train that kind of jumps to different stops. So if you're going all the way from the bottom of Manhattan to the top of the Bronx, you want to be on an express train to go up faster. So the Bronx Zoo, this large and lush zoo, is home to tigers, bison, elephants, lions, flamingos, and bald eagles, which is our U.S. national bird. There is also a ropes course and the opportunity to pay extra for a one-on-one encounter with animals like the cheetah, pictured below. So we have one of the very cute animals, the cheetah, there pictured. So I haven't actually met one in person, but apparently it's an opportunity they have at the Bronx Zoo. And this is a very interesting place because it's a very large zoo and very lush. As I use that word, there's a lot of trees and greenery, and you feel like you're in a forest or a jungle, but you're actually in the Bronx, in the city, in New York City. And as I said, there's a ropes course. So that will mean you'll follow ropes through the trees. So maybe walking from one tree to another on a rope, or zip lining. So following kind of, I think it's called the treetop adventure, and you follow that through the woods. So that's kind of an interesting athletic approach. And the Bronx Zoo has a lot of different events. So I think coming up in the fall, they have something called Boo at the zoo. So of course, Boo is what a ghost says to scare you. So that's a Halloween event. They always have a little wordplay. And they also have an event that's called Brew at the zoo. So a brew is another word for beer, like from a brewery. So they have that event where local artisan breweries will come and you can taste different beers and be at the zoo, which is a nice space to be. And it's also free to visit on Wednesdays. I'm not sure if for the whole family or just for children, but it's a good option for families to go on Wednesday because it's more affordable. Okay. So we are now journeying beyond, au-delà, beyond the boroughs of New York City and going to one of my favorite places in New York. So we're off to Fire Island. So I'll tell you a little bit about this place. So this barrier island south of Long Island features Atlantic beaches, wooden boardwalks, car-free communities full of quirky houses, and a lighthouse, the first landmark that many immigrants saw when they came to America on ships. Fire Island has historically been a haven for the LGBTQ plus community, welcoming artists, writers, and activists, and hosting events revolving around drag or pride. So this is one of the beaches, one of many beaches you can reach from New York City. We also have beaches that are free and accessible in New York City as well, Atlantic Ocean beaches with waves, with surfing. So that's a really amazing part of living in New York. And this one is actually a bit further. So east of Queens and Brooklyn, we have Long Island, which is quite a big area. A lot of people with families live there. And then we have a tiny called Barrier Island that's on the Atlantic Ocean called Fire Island, and it has many different beach communities along it. As I say here, the majority of the island, there are no cars. So people ride bicycles, people walk, you take another ferry, people travel in boats. So it's a really really escapist experience. You feel like you're escaping from the city. And it has kind of a quirky identity. So I chose this word quirky, which means like eccentric or unique. This word is often used to describe Phoebe in Friends. So they're kind of very quirky places. And I'll show you one of these quirky houses. It's not the most quirky house, but here I have one of the houses that has some bright colors, a lot of plants, a lot of lights. So kind of a unique style to this house. And I've seen when visiting other houses that are about pirates. So they have kind of these fake pirates, or it looks like a pirate ship, or something about mermaids. So they'll have decoration inspired by mermaids or fish. So it's fun just to walk and see the different houses. They're very unique. And then we have one of the events over here. So we have an event called the Invasion, where people from one part of Fire Island come to another one and invade. But it's not like a bad invasion. It's just kind of a joke. They just come to visit. And you can see really beautiful big beach with nice fine sand and beautiful comfortable sand and nice Atlantic waves. So if you like a beach, this is definitely the place to go. All right, so because we're in the season now, we're going to talk about Halloween. So a great place to go on Halloween is up along the Hudson River. So if we think about New York City and we have Manhattan, above we have the Bronx, and then we have where I grew up, which is on the Atlantic Ocean. And the other side, we have along the Hudson River. That's what we'll look at here. So the Hudson River runs 315 miles, 507 kilometers from the Adirondack Mountains through New York City and into the Atlantic Ocean. Towns along the Hudson are great places to see fall foliage. So very, very similar to the French word for all those colorful leaves, as we can see in this photo, orange leaves, red leaves, yellow leaves, very beautiful. For Halloween, the best choice is Sleepy Hollow, the setting for the famous 1820 horror story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, featuring the frightening Headless Horseman. The author, Washington Irving, gave New Yorkers the nickname Knickerbockers, which is also the name of the basketball team, the New York Knicks. So this was, I believe it was a word he just invented to call people from New York. So Knickerbockers. So now it's a basketball team. And this was his creation in the story, was a man riding on a horse with no head. He had been, I believe, a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and now he was riding around with no head. So they have some people like this on Halloween. Okay, so let's go over some of the vocabulary we've seen together. So we have roughly, which we're going to use to say approximately, about, we're not exactly sure. We have twice the size of. So we saw that, for example, Brooklyn is twice the size of Paris. And then 3 times as big as. We saw that Queens, the biggest borough, is 3 times as big as Paris. About we can use in 2 ways. So about can also mean more or less, approximately, or we can say about the subject of something. This book is about French history. So we have half the size of, that would be Manhattan is half the size of Paris. We have overall, which is an important word. I know some of my students like to say global or globally, but that would actually mean mondialement. So here we want to be the general, the total, that's overall. We saw that Paris is more densely populated. The population is packed together compared to New York. We saw square miles, of course, our measurement. The pier that was in South Street Seaport, the pier you have going out into the ocean. We talked about, of course, the Revolutionary War, as we call it, and George Washington's hideout, Geshette, and the cobblestone streets that are difficult to walk on in high heels. And then we have a few, I won't go over everything to leave a bit of time, but we have nearby. So if something is close, we say, oh, Starbucks is nearby. We have one to be really careful about is comprehensive. So this can be like a false friend. So this means that it's very complete. It's complete, it's exhaustive, we would say. So it's very thorough. It has everything. It has all the information. So sometimes my students think this means understanding, but it's not the same as in French. So this one you should be careful about. And then what else do we have? Let's see. Oh, yeah, we use the word catch. So I advise going to catch a baseball game. So, of course, catch in baseball, you can catch a ball like that, but it can also be a very relaxed, informal way to say, go see something. So I could say, let's go catch a movie tonight. Let's go see a movie. It's not very formal. And then a few here. Let's see if there's anything interesting for us. So quirky is a fun adjective. If something's a little bit unusual, it's a pretty positive adjective. It's not negative, but maybe some people don't want to be quirky. But the houses in Fire Island with their colors and their decorations, they're very unique. They're very quirky. So we have foliage. So we have some fall foliage tours in the US, especially up the East Coast into Vermont, New Hampshire. There's some really beautiful foliage, orange, red, yellow. And then we have Knickerbocker, which is our nickname for New Yorkers from a very long time ago. Okay. So I guess if anyone has a question, they can raise their hand or put it in the chat, or any questions about visiting New York or how to use the words. Let's see, maybe I'll turn on some mics in case someone wants to. What about let's see. Oh, the circulation as in the traffic? The traffic? Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of traffic. So, I mean, I don't drive and I would never drive in New York City, but some people do drive, especially the outer boroughs, but I do not recommend driving. There's a lot of traffic for sure. Luckily, we have a lot of public transportation, but it can depend. Sometimes, just like in Paris, there can be difficulties with limited mobility. So people who have limited mobility might want to take Uber or rent a car. But in general, people who really live in New York City don't drive. It's also very, very expensive to park your car. So I think maybe a parking space maybe would be like $500 a month, maybe, if you want to have a parking space. So it's not very realistic in New York to have a car unless you have a special reason that you need it. Okay, so any other questions about?
Is it expensive to travel in New York City compared to Paris?
Yes, definitely. So compared to Paris, much, much more expensive. Okay. So I think almost everything will be more expensive. I mean, I think, for example, like it's not for traveling, but to give you an idea, like a 1-bedroom in New York City would be about like maybe $3,500 a month. So the cost of living is much more expensive. Restaurants are more expensive. There are some restaurants you can go to, we call like hole in the wall, which would be kind of not a very fancy, elegant restaurant, but very good food. So we do have some restaurants like that, or food trucks. And there are a lot of free things to do. So you can always Google like free things, for example, like the MoMA Free Fridays, the Museum of Modern Art, that's free on Friday afternoons. So if you're careful and you do some research, of course, visiting Central Park is free. Visiting Madison Square Park is free. Prospect Park in Brooklyn. I think it's easier to do more free things if you go when the weather is nice. So if you go in spring or summer, because you can spend a lot of time in the park, you can eat outside. You don't have to eat in a sit-down restaurant. But it's definitely, compared to Paris, it's very expensive. I find it more similar to London. If you visited London, the prices are more similar, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Oh, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's parts, of course, of New York that can be dangerous, just like Paris, just like every place in the world. I think one place is in the South Bronx. So we can see that South Bronx maybe around Yankee Stadium, around Columbia University is also not the greatest place to be. So of course they're all changing and it does depend, but I would say the safest is to be in the really touristy areas, like the center of Manhattan. I feel very safe. Williamsburg, Brooklyn is very safe. Astoria, Queens, those are all safe. So I would try to stay, more in the touristy areas. But it really depends because, as I showed, it's enormous compared to Paris. But yeah, the South Bronx and parts of Upper Manhattan, so the bottom of the Bronx into Upper Manhattan, I'm always careful when I go there. And my parents who went to a university there also say to be careful there. Yeah. So I think that's about it for today, unless anyone has anything else. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you do find a way to get to New York if you haven't been there. And of course, there's a lot of amazing resources online too. And there are actually some free things to do and some affordable restaurants, although not everything. But there's a lot to discover, and it's a wonderful big city. I think it's also a very welcoming city that's very international, and people love to meet people visiting from other countries or who speak other languages. So that's a really positive experience. And I think people like to help you find where you're going or help you find the right subway, which is really nice and welcoming. So thank you so much for being here on a Friday. Thank you. So I'll see you guys
Bye.
maybe for another class in the future. And thanks for your
I
questions.
hope so. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for listening.